Struggling to secure all your applications with modern identity services? You're not alone. But with identity orchestration, you can say goodbye to refactoring and complexity. Strata Identity helps you modernize app identity at scale while mitigating security risks and simplifying policy management. Maintain a consistent security posture and simplify policy management with identity orchestration. If you're ready to simplify your identity environment and improve your app security, share your IAM challenge with the Strata team to get a brand new set of earbuds. Just visit securityweekly.com/strata to learn more. That's securityweekly.com/strata. Imperva is the comprehensive digital security leader on a mission to help organizations protect their data and all paths to it. Only Imperva protects all digital experiences, from business logic to APIs, microservices, the data layer, and from vulnerable legacy environments to cloud-first organizations. With an integrated approach combining network, application, and data security, Imperva protects companies ranging from cloud-native startups to global multinationals with hybrid infrastructure. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Hi, folks. I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find, talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Patrick Vandenberg about how to turn more security scanning into more effective programs by focusing on risk instead of worrying about fixing every single vuln. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, one announcement. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests. We review suggestions monthly, and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. And now, speaking of reviewing things, we've got, I think, 2 weeks of news to review here, John. It's been a while since we've been live and chatting together.
Yes, for our listeners, we're going to record this at normal speed and then run it at twice speed for you guys, so you'll get everything.
Exactly. You can listen to the slow zombie version or the fast zombie version. So do you like Danny Boyle or George Romero? It's up to you. But the other thing, speaking of ancient things that's still coming back from the dead, cross-site scripting. John, even Patrick was using it because it's an easy example, talking about scanners, but Microsoft Azure has some XSS. The interesting thing about it, at least, was in postMessage. So here's a new, HTML5, modern HTML type of technology. And what stood out to me is the level of detail in this write-up from the Orca security researchers. So I really love that aspect and the diligence they put into it, because not only did they say, well, we think we have identified the flaw, but we can't exploit it. They went and said, no, this endpoint doesn't work, this endpoint doesn't work. We finally found one where Microsoft forgot to actually create an allow list and follow a lot of the good practices that are stated even within the RFC for or the spec for postMessage. And I also linked to the Mozilla Developer Network. Their warnings about this cannot be overstated. Failure to check the origin, which Microsoft was doing except for one or two spots, and possibly source properties enables cross-site scripting attacks. And lo and behold, that's what happened. So that was what stood out for me. And I don't know if you have been digging into the nuances of modern day post-message exploitation or cross-site scripting, John, or if this is just going to trigger you with having to talk about Microsoft and Azure once again.
I'm going to dance around a little bit. I haven't looked at the new XSS, and to be honest, I think that's both for me and probably for most of our listeners something to go back and dig into and sort of look a little closer, right? You think like, oh, it's XSS. No, this is new, friendly, fun XSS. Well, maybe not friendly. But where this was interesting to me is, we were talking a little bit about DAS in the last half. Mostly I asked. But, these type of things can be in many cases caught as part of your CI process now. This is something that's testable for. And as you said, Oracle went through and tested for this, right? They failed, and finally got a hit, and made a very meaty. We're getting into a bad habit here, I think, here of like talking about, oh, that's a great write-up. This is a long one, guys. But
Indeed.
with lots of screenshots. I mean, it's meaty, plus it's pretty pictures for John. But no, I think it's a reminder of, how do we test for these things? Is your tester, whatever testing you're using, is it new enough and up to date enough that it's going to capture a new style of an XSS attack? So I think there's takeaways beside where it came from.
Indeed. And I did want to, I linked to an article from The Record that was also talking about this because it talked about Microsoft's response to it. And there were two things that stood out to me that I think represent or are indicative of good maturity, and not just saying we have a scanner, but using the scanner. And this is what, to roughly quote, is that speaking of Microsoft, their security engineers updated their internal rules to improve scanning for this class of bug. So as you said, this should be the type of thing that should be easy to lint for, find in your CI/CD. Humans make mistakes, and they had a scanning capability. Now they're just updated that scanning capability to find this miss. And the other thing they mentioned is they did some variant hunting. So they don't just say, here is the bastion or here's the registry service for Azure. They'll start looking for this pattern everywhere else. And I think those are just good lessons that any organizations can take. If you have a scanner, a bug bounty report comes in, you got to, you missed something, go back, check the rules, see not only can it find this for this particular instance, but where else is this, dangerous code lurking?
And I think that goes back a little bit, again, to what Patrick was talking about in the last half of, which I'll say in full disclosure, I'm not sure I fully buy into this, but I like the idea of if you keep finding the same vulnerability, you get better at fixing it, it becomes less of an issue. So yeah, scan often, scan deep, and actually fix the things when you find them. So tying them together.
Actually fix the things. Speaking of tying things together, I want to tie this. We're in Cloudland, and last time we chatted, John, we ran out of time to talk about the big IAM challenge.
Yes.
This was basically a CTF from Wiz, who are writing up a really neat way just to test your skills with specifically AWS IAM. And I know that this was something you wanted to talk about. So tell us more about this and why it appeals to you.
So I think what's really interesting about IAM, besides, I think we hit on this really briefly last time. If you think about, so IAM is Amazon's both the policy language for describing what principles or what things should be able to access what other things with what permissions. I'm starting at a very high hand wavy point of view because that's really the way it's written. And then being able to sort of dive down into really sort of, allow who should be doing what, or, and this allows you to do things like maybe have something which appears to be public, but when you look a little bit closer, it's only been able to be accessible by certain identities. But personally, for me, for years, I've used Amazon now since I've been checking recently. I think it's 2009 or 2010. 2010, a year after it started. IAM's always been a weak point of mine because writing the policies is until you admit and accept and really embrace and dive into it, it can be sort of an ugly thing. So I think what was sort of cool about this is, and we have another article I want to hit here talking about pen testing. Part of the thing about the pen testing, something like Amazon, is you're really looking for, in many cases, weaknesses in the authorizations which have been provided. So I think this is super important for anyone who's doing cloudy type stuff to get into, but also it gives some really great examples of what is wrong with a particular IAM policy. Like even straight, it's if you hit the link for this, folks, it's a little tiny bit confusing, or it could be, but there's it's confusing, but there's a big pink button which you should click on. It says View IAM Policy, and it gives you a policy to start with around allow anyone to access S3 or a bucket on S3, and then allow being able to both get as well as list off that bucket, which is sort of that pair is usually needed together. But okay, based off of that, what can you get access to that, and then you paste the flag, and then you keep going. So I think it's a fun, for those of us who like to learn hands-on, I think it's a fun way to sort of explore this space.
Indeed. And you mentioned both. You actually have another article about IAM as well,
Yes.
but this AWS pen testing, we'll bring them all together. This was a really fun article as well, and I think it's nice to see. We want to highlight these because they show techniques. They show here's how I do something. And this doesn't mean this is the one true way to pen test, because I don't think that exists.
Yep.
But this is how someone learns. People, as you often like to mention, you learn visually. So trick for all of you researchers out there, have lots of screenshots in your posts so we can get them by John. But this is neat because it talks about what we might think is common. Enumerate, look at the configurations, start with a service. But if we just were doing something educational and just said at that level, someone would still be lost. Well, what am I supposed to do? What does that mean for AWS? And this article walks through specifically what that means and provides a couple resources. We've mentioned Cloud Vuln DB before, and just areas to learn from about what have other people found that maybe I'm going to start looking for as well. Case in point, cross-site scripting and postMessage.
Yes. So I thought this was fun. Lizzie is someone I met at a local Cloud Security Alliance meetup, and this sort of comes off as the way they are, but their sort of personality I think really comes out through in this. But what was interesting to me about this is, I think for a lot of people when you think about pen testing the cloud, you're thinking about, okay, here's a web app, and let's go and figure out how to get into it. But it's like, how do you do the wider thing, right? How do you access this? And right, okay, well, if you're going from the point of view of I don't have access into this thing, okay, I need to figure out somehow how do I. But like there's a very sort of basic but obvious thing she's starting with is get a read-only account, and then based off of that, start enumerating through and actually trying to understand what's going on inside, and pair it back with the IAM article we just had. So I thought I think for a lot of people, I think for some people that might be a bit of a, got it, that's how I do it. So that's really the why I brought this in here, but it's a good write-up.
Good write-up, and it does link to 2 other CTFs as well. So for those of you, if you like the big IAM challenge, check out this article in flaws.cloud and the other one for more ways to hone your skills. So let's stay in Cloudland and IAM, John, and have you talk about Keycloak, which sounds like an uncommon magic item in D&D.
Yes. So I think I mentioned it in my blurb on the show notes, and I'll say it here. This is not. I know we've had sponsors on that have their own sort of authentication or authorization systems, and we're just talking about Amazon, who has their own authentication and many authentication authorization systems. But I'd say for me, I work a lot with startups. I talk to a lot of startups. I've done a few startups. I'll frequently get people coming to me going, how do I do authentication or authorization or both in my early stage startup? When I'm writing that application, how do I do this? Like, which database do I use? No. Right? And that's sort of where it came at this from, because I'll usually recommend to those folks Keycloak. And the reason I say that is so you're not tied into a single cloud provider. Cognito is pretty good. I know some people use it at scale. That sort of scares me, but that's my own heebie-jeebies. I'm sure the other guys have something too. I know Amazon better. But Keycloak I've used, and I've had friends who've used it quite successfully in smaller, large orgs. So I thought, it's one thing for me to say, hey, go use Keycloak. But what's neat about this is like, this is part 1, and it's a pretty decent length write-up on like, how do you actually get going with this? And I think hopefully by now he's got part 2 out. It's fairly new, so maybe not 2 weeks ago. So we might still be working on part 2. But yeah, I think that's for folks who actually want to do this stuff or actually get the hands dirty. We're talking about some hands-on stuff this episode, so there you go.
We are, and that's a great setup for speaking of hands-on stuff. There's an article from James Kettle, Port Swigger himself, good old @albinowax if you follow him on Twitter, but talking about how he chooses security topics. And so we, of course, RIP Daily Swig. We love the Daily Swig as a source of news, and we've covered HTTP request smuggling several times because James made quite the name for himself with 2 or 3 years in a row of getting some great DEF CON Black Hat presentations about request smuggling. But what's neat about this is he steps back a little bit, and to work, actually, spoilers, at the end of the article, he says, I don't want to be pigeonholed, or I don't want to just be only focusing on request smuggling. There's more interesting things out there, which is why he's been looking at web-based race conditions now. But to jump back to the start of the article, he's talking about, how do I actually turn a thought into execution? I'm thinking about an area of research. Let me just start poking, reading a spec, reading an RFC, things like that, and failing. Maybe you don't find a good vulnerability in the latest web, I was going to say Web 3. HTTP 3 spec, or something like that. Because we finally have some new specs in HTTP. Do you fail quickly and move on, or do you start poking around and look at a different aspect of the postMessage setup? And part of that is that failure. I wanted to also just tie it back to a little bit of that diligence that we saw in the Orca security researchers. But this, I thought, was just a great. It's really brief, so it's not a long article, and hopefully it's going to be some inspiration for those of you out there who are thinking that, oh, but there's cross-site scripting, there's XXE, all the OWASP top 10 types of web vulns have been found in Enumerator. There's nothing new out there. Well, maybe there actually is. Request smuggling, web race conditions, and so on. So something else that can make John perk up and listen as I bring in a bunch of these web types of issues.
I was going to say Web 3, HTTP 3, they're the same thing, aren't they? You knife straight in and twist.
Must resist, yes.
Yeah, I mean, we've already shown here today that it's with XSS stuff. There's always a new way to skin these things. It's interesting. I've gotten this question before. I want to say I'm anywhere near on the same sort of scale as James, but I've heard people ask this question before. I'll put it that way. And at least for me, it's I'm the guy who walks down the street jiggling doorknobs, right? Like, drives my wife nuts, but yes, I do it. And that sort of thing is like what. Maybe you don't want to be. Maybe when you're starting, you want to focus on an area. Maybe when you're starting, you want to look for anything which catches your attention. But at the same time, it's like what. At least to me, it's what interests me. It's like, okay, sometimes I grab an app when I'm using a new app. I just start poking. Usually for me now, there's a spidey sense, like an error doesn't look right, and that tells me that someone they're not putting the effort in coding this properly. And like, okay, well, what is the whole thing like that? But yeah, this is probably a good thing to share with your team and think through, what are you looking for? Even like your QA people, how do we do this type of stuff?
Yeah, and I think another thing too is knowing when to bail. How is part of that? Say let's be brainstorming and do the yes and approach, if you will, of research, but saying, oh, we're not finding. We're hitting roadblocks. We're not finding anything juicy in terms of a vulnerability. But there's also perhaps, building on your point, James makes a distinction between direct impact versus audience impact. Meaning, in James's voice, do I want to tell a war story about hacking a particular CDN and how many different ways I could take it apart, left, right, center? Or do I want to find a topic that's more universal, some tools that developers, AppSec teams can take and apply to their own environments, which is a broader audience. That's more impactful, it elevates more of, if you will, the AppSec community. I think that's also just kind of it's not a judgment call on either one. It's just a distinction of approach and what do we want to look for in terms of how do we want to invest our time and what do we want to get out of it in terms of the type of conference presentation or ultimate value that we're going to deliver to others versus a story versus tools, that type of thing.
Yep. And I think your phrase there really quickly on this one is your voice, right? Because what I write in the blog posts, well, besides the fact it could be a lot more nerdy and technical, and when you're giving a talk, at least from my point, if I'm doing it right, if I'm giving a talk, I'm entertaining people. You want them to come in a room, you want them to come back in the room next time. So you're not just like talking about, some thing you cracked. It's like, okay, how do I make this interesting for other people to listen to for 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes? So yeah, anyways, neat.
Yes, so let's put that, I mentioned Web 3 because I was peeking ahead to the news. So John, let's put what you just said into practice and make this bug bounty article interesting and appealing to me.
Okay, this is crypto. rainbow hands. I thought this one was neat. So this is on Cointelegraph, which is what's her name? Coinbase's blog, if I remember right. I'm pretty sure. But this pops up fairly frequently in my ways I get news. But this I thought was a neat one. So the idea here, if I can make this interesting, is we've talked about bug bounties for quite a while. Okay, we just lost half our audience. But for those who are still listening, why the other half just left is often a bug bounty is not successful, or it's sort of, it's a lot of money leaving the company without really showing anything for it. The point is, this article here is saying, hey, if a bug bounty isn't done in an effective way, those orgs that don't have an effective way of doing it, either it's not scoped right, or they're not responding to it right, or whatever have it. There's a few examples in the story. Those orgs are paying a higher price, either through and there's some really interesting. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So it's either through direct payouts, or how they get hacked, or how they're getting compromised, whatever's going on. So the interesting part on this is it seems like in the crypto world, a lot of these are resulting in negotiations. So and we've seen this, right? Probably in the news is some person goes and hacks some Web3 thing, whatever it is. Again, rainbow hands. And they take a whole bunch of someone's fake coins. Man, how much hand waving can I do here? So there's all this sort of, magical stuff going on. But at the end of that, the guy who now has 5 billion of the magical things goes back to the original guy and says, well, if I can keep 5 million of these, I'll help show you how it was done and give you the rest back. So there's a lot more negotiation, I think, happening in the crypto space than what we see in, at least what I've seen or my friends have seen in standard business, real business. So I thought that was sort of the interesting aspects about this, and hopefully that's entertaining.
No, I think you kept my attention. And I'll once again say, the crypto space is an excellent self-funded bug bounty, as you're pointing out about attackers getting millions of tokens, yes, ostensibly dollar value, and saying, I'll give you some percentage of it back if you, don't call the cops. And I think as a broader takeaway here is, I think, the aspect of designing a bug bounty, both to have, are the incentives well aligned, plus, do you have the maturity, speaking of trying to, is a little bit of a callback to our discussion with Patrick, do you even have a mature org to handle a bug bounty in the first place? Have you done that initial review of smart contracts in this case, or your code, or are you running your own scanners, et cetera, or are you simply using a bug bounty to subsidize external researchers to run these types of scanners against you? Now, in the Web3 place, in the crypto place spaces, a lot of these have been demonstrated as a bit more insightful that aren't going to be found by scanners, or they have been posited as theoretical, and then someone cleverly goes in and turns that theory into some dollar compromise. So it is fun to watch, I will say. So you've got my attention from there. But speaking of spending money, I wanted to shift to another article that was a follow-up from the OpenSSF, their Alpha Omega project. This was a project that, real quickly, partners with open source software to find new, as yet undiscovered vulns in open source, and importantly, to get them fixed. So OpenSSF was not saying, we're just going to run a bunch of scanners, whether it's SCA, SAS, DAST, et cetera. We're actually going to fix them. We're going to actually put money where these open source projects need help. And what's really neat is now the Python Security Foundation has their first security developer in residence. And I linked both to the announcement as well as to Seth Larson, his blog post describing this. And what I thought was interesting is that, one, of course, I love the investment in open source, but this could also, I think, be that type of thinking for orgs that are wondering, well, what should our first security hire be? Or I've heard of AppSec versus DevOps versus DevSecOps, and I don't really care about fast versus slow zombie conversation. But what are the roles and responsibilities? What are the keys to success? And I think this blog post walks through a couple things that could be relevant for orgs thinking, how do we have a security-minded developer? So that's why it grabs my attention. But John, you obviously were responding quite well to this. So how did you feel about it?
I don't know. There's something about, and this is probably more partially an emotional reaction, partially, actually something in InfoSec, OPSEC the phrase security developer in residence just puts a smile on my face. Like I think we're obviously making grounds. We're making improvements. You know, Alpha Mega's been around what 2-3 years now, I think, maybe a year or two. We're going down this path, but it's still to actually see something like that happen. And we've seen these in other projects. This isn't the first, but I think that's super cool. I'm looking forward to him fixing all the problems with Pippi.
There's just a few, indeed. But
How
let it
big
be
is that
known.
budget? Sorry.
Exactly. Let it be known. ASW 245. We found something to put a smile on John's face. So let's see if we can continue that trend. John, there's some myths that I want to mention too. As a little bit of a callback to some conversations we've had with Adrian Sanabria as well, a fellow Security Weekly host here. But you had some deep dives, especially into some kernel hacking. Let's continue this smile about things that are grabbing your attention.
I didn't realize when I first read this. I should have, but I now have Beyonce going through my head. Put an IOU ring on it. Damn it. It's a good song, but still. So yeah, this was an interesting post. Came from Hackaday. More of the hardware side of me, but I think what was interesting about this, and again, another long, we're going to start, one of these days we'll start coming back to short blog posts. But what was interesting about this is his initial focus. We were just talking about with Portswigger how he goes about finding things. This particular individual was actually decided, let's look at the newer parts of the Linux kernel, where there's been more hands in there recently, and it's fresher code, so it hasn't as many eyeballs on it. And the result of that is he found this bug in IOU ring, which is where am I? Come on, mouse. It's interesting. It's I believe he got a code execution out of
she
this.
did.
Oh, excuse me. Thank you.
Chompy. Yes.
Thank you very much. Don't like doing that. Again, it's a good write-up. It's sort of going through a little bit about and the reason I put this in here is how do you find that? How does someone go about looking at a block of code or an area of new code and thinking through, okay, is this, what happens if I do this instead of this? Again, we're getting back to that. I should probably come up with a different phrase than hacker mentality. How about researcher mentality? So I thought that was really neat. And again, I think the visuals in here aren't just for me and pretty pictures, but allows people to think through because it's a relatively complicated thing. How do you go about using something like that and actually manipulating it for good or bad? So I thought that was neat.
Yeah, and I think a good, as you said, a great compliment to the article from James, where he's focused clearly on web, but there's plenty of privileged escalation and kernel level hacking that lots of vulns yet to be found, which in this day and age, too much C code for me. So I will stick to my JavaScript and perhaps WebAssembly. But with that, I did want to speak to, there's a very short, so let's grab a short article. This was an analyst view of Gartner Security and Risk Management Summit 2023, which normally is probably a title that would make John fall asleep. No. But there were 4 bullet points in here that I wanted to talk about that I think might wake him up a bit. And these were, they're described as myths of, and I would say, platitudes. More data equals better protection. More technology equals better protection. More cybersecurity pros equals better protection. More controls equals better protection. And I think, they sound good initially, but there's a lot of ways to misuse your budget into trying to do this. And I think this is a way to just be smarter about using budget. And as a callback to our discussion with Patrick, as much as their sales folks would appreciate more DAST, let's just have more DAST. More DAST doesn't make you more secure. More DAST that leads to finding vulns and exercising the way you approach vuln management, meaning, are you targeting a vuln class? Are you adopting frameworks that make that XSS harder to introduce? Are you stepping back to figure out why do we have these severe vulns? How do we do something to avoid getting those vulns introduced altogether rather than just getting faster at fixing them? That, I think, is kind of the underlying message that I wanted to convey from this particular article.
Yeah. So first, before I go into it too far, I considered this probably one of the top conferences I never get to, the Gartner Security Conference. Every year I've got a little bit of FOMO of people who come back going oh my God, it was so great. And I think it's just a really high level of signal coming out of that. There's a vendor side of it, but I think that what they're doing is actually pretty good. Yeah, more. I think, yeah, and, right. It's those are sort of four things that vendors want to say to you, and that's I think in general one of the sort of the problems we have in the industry is so while I'm trying to I'm stumbling because I don't want to offend our last sponsor, and this isn't offending him, but I'm making sure what I say syncs with him. And Invent, pronounce that one for me. Sorry, my brain is shot. Invinci, yes. And where I'm going with this is, yes, I want you to scan more often, which is what he was saying, and then based off that find things. But that doesn't mean I want you to have 10,000 different scanners. And I think part of the issue which some people I'm seeing out there are having is they're getting all this data from all these different places. They're like, oh my God, what do I do with this? So, and that doesn't mean, because that you could go down this path of saying, okay, you've got more scanners. So that means I need more people to run those scanners. And then I need to put more controls in place for it. So I can sort of see the parallels to this, which some folks might fall into that trap. And it's sort of like, general security. If you have something which is elegant, smooth, and simple, that's probably the direction you want to go. So, but yeah.
We haven't. We're going to continue to tease what your AppSec in 3 words would be, John. But elegant, smooth, simple is going to be a candidate. So I'm going to throw that onto the list of candidates here. But on that point, having more scanning, more security, more eyes, you have a little bit of not a counterpoint to that, but a little bit of why just more eyes, more scanning doesn't always find everything. Yes. We need to be strategic about vulnerabilities. So tell us a little bit about the EKS clusters here.
Yeah, I want to get the little bit of code in here that shows it. So I thought this was interesting. Folks over at a company called Garden found a neat little, not neat, I'll call it neat, issue with Amazon CDK. So Amazon CDK, AWS CDK, is a multi-language framework, which it's for IAC to deploy stuff to the cloud or to create a cloud, or all the above. So CDK, you can run it in. I've used TypeScript in the past. I've used Python. I think there's C. Don't quote me on that one. But there's a whole bunch of different languages, which they then have this really neat library. I've spent too much time with this. This really neat library, which takes those. It basically provides higher level interfaces to take whatever that thing is, and in the end of the day, turn it down into everyone's favorite CloudFormation. And what these guys, so this is open source. It's been around they're on version 2 now. It's been around for a few years. It's out on GitHub. You can make, it's open source. You can either get it or you can find bugs and create issues, pull requests, whatever. You get the idea. But the reason I mentioned that is because it's getting a hell of a lot of eyes, unlike the source code for a CloudFormation or most things which Amazon does, right? So you'd think it'd be more secure, and it is. But these guys managed to find one of those little diamonds where when you're creating a EKS cluster through CDK, and I don't think it's specific to a language. It is, I didn't see that in there. But the result of that is the permissions which that cluster are created with are a little more open than what they should be. So the creation rule which is used grants system master, which in Kubernetes speak is root or God, and that's sort of not great. So they managed to figure that out, track that down, and actually that's a pretty good find. So I thought this was, again, with my my ongoing thing of like, here's something you can do or read about how to do in your org or in your, whether that's a commercial or whatever. But I thought it was interesting to see that in something with that many eyes on it that as CDK has.
It is. And the only thing I can add to that is I love the aspect of the solution where, they weren't just fixing this one narrow vuln, but improving, the creation role, the master's role. And so that, as they say, they should be making this more safe, more secure by default. And that's what we love to see, rather than having to have the hardening guide, which is, in this day and age, bit of a code smell.
Especially real quickly, especially for something like CDK, right? Where like the idea of CDK is you're automating something. So don't automate and then make the guys who are automating have to harden what they're, Anyways, go on.
No, I think we touched on a couple CTFs, and I did just want to include one other article from Dark Reading that was talking about free training resources. And I think my only reaction to this is that it listed 4 or 5 references. I threw Portswigger's Web Academy in there because I think that's a really good one. But there is, in fact, an aspect of a lot of free cybersecurity, infosec courses out there, content out there. But not everybody's also talking about to Patrick's discussion with him, priority. Not everybody has infinite time. So how do we find what are the useful resources for what I want to learn? And I think we as ASW, I think we'll have to do a little bit better job of highlighting that. So listeners, do please let us know what resources you found really valuable, whether specific to cloud, even AWS or GCP or Azure for that matter, or others, pen testing, et cetera, because we'd love to highlight something that is impactful or useful to listeners. So that's what I wanted to talk about it. But John, you've been giving us a lot of good articles this week. We'll let you close us out either with some free training or some free thoughts from the mind of Kinsella.
I'm going to ask for free thoughts from our listeners. So I think this training stuff is great. I've been mentoring a few junior either ops people or developer types recently. And what's interesting is, how do you get that first job, right? You want to be able to show something you've done. So I probably said on here in the past, if you are a developer, go and either contribute to open source or just have like a GitHub with a bunch of really interesting stuff on there. That at least catches my attention when I'm looking at someone's resume. If you're trying to get into cloud, or you want to have some sort of operational role, showing me like your, CloudFormation or your CDK, that doesn't. I want to see like what have you done in production? Show me something you've done. But unless you've worked at an org that's allowing you to do that, you're not going to be able to do it. So if our listeners know of any either ways where interns can get involved in a space like that, or have some sort of actual production hands-on usage. It could be a lab, but don't send me I'm not looking for I see a lot of people go through boot camps or Coursera's, and those are great, but I see that on a resume. I'm like, that's a boot camp. That's not real life production. Someone had production experience. So I'm trying to figure out how do you crack that. So if anyone has ideas, the usual ways to hear from us or get to us, I'd love to hear either on Discord or Twitter or email or LinkedIn. So that's my ask for the week.
It's an excellent ask. Thank you, John. And thank you indeed, everyone else, for joining us. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of time, check out The Forever War by Bunny X. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.